Okay, the world is not fair. He got only one glass. I got two, no. Thank you for inviting me for this talk. It's entitled Prosociality and Trust. Both will be addressed. I did it with a lot of colleagues, and over the years, every now and then I will go back a little bit in time. But what I will do is I will talk about social value orientation and social mindfulness as two manifestations of prosociality. And I'll talk about trust, the cultural aspects of it, and some biological aspects of it. And as I said, every now and then I will go back in time a little bit. And first I would like to briefly note the theoretical framework that I adopt for this research. It's based on interdependence theory. It's a theory that really focuses on situations. The principle of structure is very important to this theory. The structure is a guiding framework for how people will react, what kind of motives may be activated or not, etc., etc. A second principle that is very important from a psychological point of view, which is that people will do something to that structure, they will make something of that situation, they may transform situations according to their motives. For example, if you're very much egalitarian in orientation, you're very likely to construe that situation differently from a person who is merely self-interested, for example. And that's another principle, and this theory also assumes that there are broader motives than just rational self-interest, and egalitarianism, for example, is a very important one. And the final key principle of this theory is that there's a strong focus on interaction, and that means that you need to know the situation and the two persons that are interacting in those situations. Social interactions is also important because that's basically what we see. If we see cooperative behavior, we often see it in the context of a past interaction and an anticipation of future interaction. So this is something that we see. It's not so much the intentions and not even necessarily the behavior that we see, it's the interactions. And interactions are also what shapes us, in part independently, but also, of course, in combination with genetic influences. So there's a little bit the background of this whole program of research, and one thing that we have used in the past is a so-called decomposed game. It's rooted in the large literature on precise lemmas, and what that large literature has found, especially during the 60s and 70s and 80s, is quite a bit of irregularity within individuals in how they approach social dilemmas. And we constructed a decomposed game which is something like this. People are asked to choose among three options that differ in the points that are allocated to yourself and to another person. We say to participants that the order is hypothetical. You've never knowingly met this person and you will never knowingly meet this other person. And the points are valuable to both self and the other person. Then what we see in a game like this is that just a majority, like 50 to 60%, will consistently, across a number of those games, choose for option C. What those people are concerned with is especially equality in outcomes, that they get a fair share, that they get equal amounts, and also to some degree, probably to a lesser degree, they are interested in enhancing collective outcomes. Then there are also people who only look at the top row. They choose option B, and they literally are looking only at the top row. There's some research doing on this, and for example, they have the shortest response latencies in a test like this. And these are called individualists. So they are individualistic in orientation. About 30% of the people are classified that way. Then a third group is a very interesting group. We call them comparators. They are really interested in not how big the size of their own car is, as long as that car is bigger than your neighbor's car. So it's a real competitive orientation. And at the time when I started doing this, I was, well, I wouldn't say I'm the most prosocial person in the world, but there is something, I found it shocking that in a test like this, that people spontaneously, there's no need to do this, they consistently, about 10 to 15% of the people consistently choose option A. And they just want to have more points than the other person. Okay, this is a sort of summary of what I've just said, and this is in economics and also in social psychology, we sometimes model this, and this is a utility model that one could use, for example, to summarize what kind of orientations there are in the world. And I also should note that this decomposed game that I just showed is based on a lot of games, actually, and we, at a certain moment, we have provided some consensus that if we use those 9 games, and we have also done a lot of validation, and some of which I will show today, showing that these instruments, you assess it in a couple of minutes, 9 of those games, and you'll see later on, within half an hour, you know what the consequences may be. So basically, what we also did in programs of research is we first assess social orientation, sometimes some weeks before, sometimes in the same session, and then we had them interact in, for example, the commons dilemmas, the social dilemmas that you described. And, but often there's a little bit of a focus on the 2-person situations, and what you see is that prosocials are conditional cooperators. They are not walkovers. They tend to be cooperative, approach other people cooperatively, but they rapidly turn to non-cooperation if the other person does not cooperate. So they are not walkovers, they are very egalitarian. And they might be a little bit emotional about it even. Individualists are a little bit less emotional in that sense. They are instrumental cooperators. They cooperate if they can benefit by doing so. And so they, for example, will respond cooperatively and develop patterns of stable cooperation with a other person who pursues tit for tat, for example, because that in the long term is very functional for an individualist to do. Comparators, they are consistent non-cooperators. It's quite amazing. Even in close relationships, we have some evidence that these are the people who are not willing to sacrifice, for example. Individualists are, actually. Individualists are if they are highly committed to their partner. If not, don't trust on their levels of sacrifice. Okay, there's a lot more about this. For example, smiling. Not on pictures, by the way. On pictures, we all tend to smile. But when in action, if you ask a person to describe just a very mundane thing that you did the last weekend, then what you see is that people differ in terms of how much there's a smile, a spontaneous smile on their face. And it's measured by Paul Ekman's specific indices, like, for example, cheek raises, lip pulls, etc., as an indicator of smiling. And what you see is actually that prosocials tend to smile more when talking about a mundane event than individuals or comparators who tend to smile less. Donation to noble causes, judgments of might and morality. For example, the prosocials are more likely to think in terms, to view a social dilemma in terms of good and bad, morally good and bad, whereas individuals and comparators also think in terms of social dilemmas as in terms of dumb and smart decisions that you can make. So they have a somewhat different frame. It's important to know that even though we do predictably differ in those orientations, it's also true that people are quite flexible in being able to adopt another person's orientation. So, for example, if a prosocial person is asked to think and act like a competitive person, a prosocial person is very likely to be able to do this. So, for example, all of a sudden for example, to perceive a social dilemma in terms of might, in terms of intelligence. It's something that they normally would not do. I have a whole theory about it. I wouldn't go into this. I just would like to describe some further findings. Another finding is that it's also reflected in how they deal with justice. For prosocial, as we all know, procedural justice is very important to people. People like to have voice in decision-making procedures. And for prosocial, there's a whole large literature on this in law and in social psychology. And what you see is that prosocials, they value equality also, for example, in procedural justice. If I get voice in a decision-making procedure, other people should get also voice. Individuals and comparators primarily look at whether they themselves get voice or not. There's also neurological research on this, and showing basically that if there is a threat to equality, then you see that prosocials are especially vigilant and become aroused, extra aroused, and afraid that something bad may happen. So then the amygdala will, for example, be activated in response to something that is a violation of fairness and of equality. Now, where do those differences in social orientation come from? I'm sure everybody here in this audience is asking, what am I exactly, a prosocial, individualist, or comparator? Well, maybe you can infer from some other findings This is some finding based on fairly large data sets. For example, there's a link with, not a very strong link, but there's a link with social value orientation and the number of siblings. Prosocials tend to have greater number of siblings than individuals and comparators. But that effect is completely explained by the number of sisters. And in fact, so prosocials have a greater number of, so people are smiling there, I see some prosocials there. So people are really, basically the effect is that if you have a sister, you're much more likely, one sister does the trick already, it seems, you're more likely to be prosocial than if you have no sisters at all. For older siblings, which I find also quite interesting actually, is that you're more likely to be individualistic if you're the oldest person in the family, or the only person, which also makes you the oldest. But that's another aspect of this. Now you may think, well, that's bad news actually. There's some good news as well, because over a lifetime, I must admit this is cross-sectional research, not longitudinal research. I'm not old enough to do that kind of longitudinal research over 60 years. But what you see is actually that in cross-sectional research, you see that there's a nice increase in prosocial orientation. So the older you are, the more likely you are prosocial, and the less likely you are individualistic or competitive. I must admit that I have now also other data that actually shows that at the age of 65 things are changing a little bit. And this was a sample up until 68 more or less, but after 65 there seems to be a trend towards individualism again. So be aware of that. Okay, these differences are interesting. When I started this line of research on decomposed games, I was skeptical, to be honest, and through doing this research, I just saw a lot of other things that it works in many different circumstances. Something that I found really quite amazing was this. We compared psychology students with economic students in their first year, and they both took the first class in psychology. And so it's basically an same group, identical group. And you see that the distribution is just very different. In psychology, we see a majority of prosocials, and in economics, we see already a majority of individualists. This is something, it's quite interesting when you compare it with a representative sample in the Netherlands. These are Dutch students. When you compare it to a representative sample in the Netherlands, the psychology students look much more like a representative sample in the Netherlands than the economic students. Okay, these are the percentages. I must admit that there's a big gender differences between psychology students and economic students, but even if you control for those gender differences, you see that this effect is still there, although weaker. There's also a link with political orientation. I'll go very quickly. These are just two big data sets, both longitudinal studies, one in Italy, one in the Netherlands. In Italy, people are used to a 4-category system of political orientation or voting, and you see a nice link such that among the left-winged people, the percentages of prosocials is much higher than among the right-wing people. And this was when social value orientation was measured 4 weeks before we measured their voting. And here we found the same pattern. In Holland, we have more like a three-party system. We have lots of parties, too many actually, but they are basically categorized as left, center, and right, and we find basically the same pattern. Here, social value orientation was measured 8 months before the voting. Now, this is something, what have we learned from all of this? Well, I've really, my confidence in this measurement really has grown over the years, as you probably can imagine. Also, I think the latter data set was quite impressive when you measure something 8 months before, and then there's a lot of political issues, debate, etc., and still you find a fairly nice and strong link with how they vote. To me, is quite interesting. It's also interesting from the perspective of instrumental cooperation, or how people want others in the society to make a more cooperative place, for example. And I think the social value orientation concept in that sense is quite important to the dynamics of research stewardship, a central theme here. Okay, now the social evaluation, I've done a lot of research on this, and this is only part of what I can share. But there's one thing about this whole history of research which has to do with the fact that social evaluation is basically motivation. If you are prosocial, you behave prosocially, and that's it. But actually in everyday life, that's not always true. In social dilemmas the same. I mean, if you want to be cooperative, you can. But that's not really true in everyday life. Often you cannot even see the prosocial option. You do not even know how to be cooperative. Or sometimes you may also try to make a cooperative choice, but you do not succeed in it. For example, you might try to be on time for a meeting, but you arrive too late because of a traffic jam that you could not foresee. So there's a lot of things in between, actually, between what you want to do, what the kind of behavior that you want to display, and the kind of behavior that you actually display. And based on those concerns, we developed a concept which we call social mindfulness. It's also inspired by my son, actually, who we were having breakfast. My wife and daughter were still not there, and you have to realize we were in Italy, close to Rome. I was reading magazines. And the day before, he had asked me the question, Papa, what do you actually do at your office all day? I said, well, I study games. Oh, that's nice, games. And I told him a little bit more about the games that we study and why it is interesting, etc., etc. And maybe I spent 45 minutes talking to him. I had no clue whether he had understood anything I said, or well, he did not respond. But then the next morning I was having breakfast with him, and I was checking out where to go in Rome, and there were, on the table, there were 3 pots of marmalade, and 1 was blackberry and 2 were strawberry. And then he asked me the question, which cup of marmalade would you like, Daddy? And I said, well, I don't like strawberry, I like the blackberry. And then he said to me, well, that's not very nice, you know, because then you don't leave me any choice. And that's of course correct, and I felt a little bit uncomfortable, but yeah, he's right. And but I had a nice excuse because I was checking everything about Rome, and but then I developed the concept of social mindfulness. It's indeed not very socially mindful what I did to him, because I did not leave him any choice. And then you see, once you think in terms of the concept of social mindfulness, you see it everywhere, and especially the socially unmindful acts, like for example in a shopping mall, in a grocery store, where for example somebody's blocking your way, and often the person who's blocking your way, you have no clue, that person probably has no clue that he or she is blocking your way, but you certainly do realize that. Okay, we developed a measure, so for example, and when we are doing this, there were actually 2 papers that had been using sort of similar measures. Hazel Marcus and Toshio Yamagishi had developed a so-called pen measure, and people were able to pick a pen, and so we built on this, and we made this a little bit bigger and developed an instrument, and this is what it looks like. So for example, the first choice is really like, which kind of apple would you like, and if you're socially mindful, you would take a green apple. And the second is just a filler to distract them a little bit. And so we constructed the whole instrument, and then sushis, and we have all sorts of things, hats. But every time, for the things that matter, for the items in our questionnaire, basically, in our instrument that matters, there's 1 unique and then 3 similar or identical objects. And we also include some 3 objects, items. So it's a whole instrument, and we have developed this, and something really interesting, and the first phase, of course, is the validation part. We'd like to know whether it works, and so instructing concern for others really enhances social mindfulness. So if you ask people, please take into account another person's interest, then they become more socially mindful over time. People are more socially mindful to friends than to strangers. People are also more socially mindful to faces that look trustworthy, high trust faces. Also based on old research that have used those phases. And it was also interesting to see that it's associated with standardized measurement self-reports of prosocial personality. So honesty, humility, for example, agreeableness, all correlations are empathic concern and perspective taking, all in the area of correlations higher than 0.20 typically. And we have seen this, we have replicated this now several times. And so that we have also gained confidence in this measure, even though a lot needs to be happened. happening more about this measure. Those two are really relevant to lots of situations. I think the social mindfulness measure, you can do a lot more to it. You can also have different measurements. One key issue, for example, and this is an example we discussed in a small group yesterday. For example, if somebody asks you on the street, do you know a nice restaurant here? Then you could say, yes, around the corner is a nice restaurant, but you could also ask, what kind of food would you like? And that's, of course, a very socially mindful question. Then you are gathering information about the other person's preferences, and then you know more about the other person, and you're in a better position to give advice, for example. But also, by the mere act of asking that question is of course an act of socially mindfulness. It's almost like an extra thinking step that you do this. And we think, and we'll do some research along those lines, that this is a powerful trust builder, so to speak. That if you're able to ask that question, if you're able to be socially mindful, that would enhance trust. My son has no trust in me anymore. So this is about social validation, social mindfulness. There seems to be kind of natural tendency. People can change it a little bit, but trust is a different concept. And I've become really intrigued by trust over the years because trust seems so crucial to a lot of people in social dilemma situations. If there's no trust, you cannot do much, actually. It's like trust is really an important aspect, a critical aspect of social dilemmas in many ways. And in fact, your manipulation is getting at it, also in a very psychological way, actually, through norms. Okay, trust. Trust it's a little bit chaotic when you look at the literature. There are lots of definitions, but this is a definition that is most widely used, I think, by Rousseau et al. It's about the positive expectations that you have about the intention or behavior of another person, and especially the acceptance of vulnerability. When you look at this whole literature, what we see is that people tend to overestimate self-interest in general. And that seems to be a very, very general phenomenon. I will also show you later some manifestations of this. The other thing that's quite interesting is also that people tend to see themselves as better than average. And not just a little bit better, but just quite a bit better than average. On questionnaires, they are willing to share that with you. But then when you look at on what dimensions do people really think that they are better than others, it's really on the morality dimensions. It's like honesty, sincerity, how sociable they are, etc. But not so much, for example, in terms of how intelligence, that effect is much smaller, or how adventurous you are, that effect is much smaller. So there seems to be the moral superiority that you assume is really quite high relative to other desirable traits. Okay, but we designed some research, and I go very quickly through this in the interest of time. The idea that, and this is very important, I think, the fact that people might underestimate how social other people, pro-social other people might be. And we developed two paradigms. This is one paradigm where there are two people. One has to throw dice, and then the other person has to throw dice, and then he knows the outcome, and then he can give you one die to you and the other one to himself. And if a person is very self-serving, and the greater the number of points you accumulate, the better. So if you're self-serving, you always give the highest outcome to yourself and the lowest outcome to the other. But you as the person, you only know the outcome of one die, and your task is to guess how many dots there would be on the other die, right? And so if you think that the other person is very self-centered, you probably think, well, he gives himself probably more than what he gave me, so probably it's the die outcome there is 5 or 6, for example. And what we see in this research, for example, is that people, generally speaking, are self-centered. So if people were not self-centered, if they were not biased, they would give, on average, 3.5 points to themselves, and 3.5 points on average to the other person, right? But people give themselves, in reality, 4 on average. But what do people expect from what other people do? it's 4.40. So there's also a perceived bias. There's a real bias, and there's also on top of that a perceived bias by people. So people overestimate the selfishness of other people. In this specific test, you could say that people are not completely fair. They're a little bit of a self-interest bias, but people overestimate that bias also by significantly. Okay, this is another way to show the same thing. We also have looked at, in a different paradigm, to make a long story short, what is interesting here is that if people have very limited information, they tend to fill in the blanks with self-interest. So for example, the other person is able to make a choice with regard to 16 coins. How many of those coins will he give to you? How many of the coins will he give to himself or herself? And if you have only limited information, so the other 14 coins are not disclosed, are not revealed, and 2 are only revealed, then we ask people, how many do you think he has given to himself? How many do you think he has given to you? Here they have very limited information, but we also looked at, for example, when people saw like 8 of those coins, and then they have half of the information already. What we typically see is that people assume more self-interest the less information they have about others. So they fill in the blanks with self-interest. And that's another demonstration that there is this myth of self-interest, a firm belief that people have that other people are self-interested. And they also tend to respond to it. Okay, now this is something that so there's the myth of self-interest. In a way, it's a little bit of a paradox, you could argue, because trust, there's a lot of literature suggesting that some doses of trust is actually quite functional to a person. At the same time, people tend to underestimate the goodness of other people. They overestimate selfishness and they underestimate how prosocial other people may be. And in a sense, that's a little bit of a paradox, and perhaps we can talk about it later, but it's an intriguing one, I think. Okay, then we did some research on the cultural aspects of generalized trust. I do not know if you are all familiar with the World's Values Survey. It's a very interesting instrument, and you can see the world map of trust, and you see some really interesting differences between countries. We did some research using a public goods dilemma. We did actually a meta-analysis on all the studies that have been done in a very standardized public good dilemma, and we have actually correlated the measures of trust according to the World Values Survey with behavior of individuals in those public goods dilemma. And it's quite amazing that there's a strong link between those two. But just to show you how, what I found most amazing, this is the item that people get in different countries. And it's a very simple item, and they translate this into a 200-point scale, varying from 0 till 200. So 0 means no trust at all, 200 absolute trust. What you find, and this is a limited set of countries, because the Scandinavian countries are not there. They are on top, by the way. Denmark, Norway, then Switzerland. The Netherlands is actually quite high, but there's a real drop at the moment, by the way, in the Netherlands. Maybe because of the economic crisis, we do not know exactly, but there's a real change at the moment. And then we see, when you look at the world, Turkey and Greece is very low, and also Brazil is very low. But you see that when you look at the differences, it's really quite amazing on this simple item. When you look at personality literature and you look at how large the differences are, you never see those big differences. It's quite amazing. So this is what a world map would look like. And you see, again, Scandinavian countries, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, they tend to be the high trust countries, and the real low trust countries tend to be Turkey, Brazil, Greece, etc. And I do not know, you know, that's also a very interesting issue, like how do economics, undermine trust, yes or no? What's the relevance of vertical trust, the trust that you have in authorities, for example, horizontal trust? So there are lots of things that come into the picture, but it's of course a very interesting picture. Now, given this, I was able to include a very brief instrument in a very rich data set regarding twins. And this was, it's just a 3-item trust scale. So one could have reservations about such a small scale, but at the same time, when you look at the World Value Survey, it's 1 item. These are 3 items, and there's some retest reliability over 2 months at least, especially regarding the belief, the trust that we have in other people, and there's a nice retest reliability of 0.76. For trust that you think others have in you, the reliability is a little bit less good. Now, this is interesting from a genetic point of view. We have over 1,000 twins, a good representation of a kind of almost a representative sample in the Netherlands. This is a twin registry at the Free University. It's a very big twin registry, and we had a subset of twins for this specific study. Now, I'm just curious what you would think in terms of, that, anything, there are so many genetic papers, and people say, well, the first law of genetics is everything, any trait is genetic. And that may be true. I think for a lot of other traits, the average heritability is around 49, 50%, so that's a lot, according to their modeling, by the way, and there are some questions about their modeling and the statistical analysis, but that's what they publish. And oops, sheets. Did you see it? That's too bad. Okay, so for general cognitive ability, it's 80%, educational attainment, it's at least 40%, achievement motivation, 60%. You really have seen it, eh? Yeah, so it's too bad. Well, it's only 5% for trust in others, for generalized trust. And this is really a puzzling finding. It's also a finding that is not easy to publish, by the way. But that as an aside, I think we'll publish it soon, actually, in a journal that is open to replication research. But the thing is that it's only 5%. The sample is not impressively large, but it's 1,000 for twin research is okay. There's retest reliability, so it's only 3 items, but it's internally consistent. So what is it exactly about trust that makes us low or high trust? And in thinking about it a little bit more, I thought, okay, the genetic influences do not seem to be impressive, let's put it mildly. Maybe it is something like, if something happens in your life, and especially recent events, for example, in Amsterdam, it's not uncommon that your bike gets stolen every now and then. Well, if that happens, there's really a decline in trust for some time. Or once my car was stolen, there's really a decline in trust for some time, maybe for, let's say, half a year. That makes that orientation that you have, the trust, temporarily stable for some time. It's not genetic, it's purely that was something that has happened to you, but that really undermined trust for some time in the general other person. It could also be that if you, for example, once you hear about, for example, the bankers being very greedy, and you see it on the news a lot of times time after time, maybe that also will undermine your trust for some time. Trust meaning your generalized expectation about the goodness, badness of good intentions of other people. So I think that those may be the influences that really undermine the trust that we have in others and may shape it. And we are now collecting more data to really see what is happening here and what it may be. So to conclude with some conclusions, well, first, social value orientations as measured by the decomposed games, you measure it in only a couple of minutes. It's highly predictive of experimental social dilemmas, but also of many everyday life situations. That is important to realize. Games work, one could argue. Trust seems to be more plastic and more malleable than cooperative motivation per se, in the sense that specific interaction experiences or media experiences may have a stronger influence perhaps on trust. And as I said, there may be a paradox here. There seems to be that some level of trust at least seems very functional, seems very healthy, but at the same time, we all have a tendency to overestimate selfishness in other people, and there seems to be a paradox here. Then when I think of, and when I translate some of this knowledge to social dilemmas at large and environmental issues, then I think what is important here is that if you want to gain trust, you should communicate trust. And that's a very simple principle. But that's something that, for example, authorities could realize is that people may not always see the cooperative option. There's a lot of ambiguity in a lot of circumstances. And even if there's a willingness to be cooperative, people may not even see it. Also, people may not always be in a position to, for example, change their behavior. We have done some research on carpooling, for example, and then you see that, and at the time when we did that research, you see that a lot of people are not able to make that choice, actually, even though they are quite willing to do that. And what we have seen at that time was also that when the Dutch government was building a carpool lane, quite a few people found it a waste of money because they felt, well, I cannot contribute to this, and this carpool lane is beneficial to those people who can do it, but I cannot do it. And so you get sometimes with some measures, some policy measures that authorities take, sometimes if people cannot do it, they may show some reactance, for example, or frustration, and perhaps share it in a variety of ways. And finally, I think we all know that politicians and authorities should provide a good example for the general public, but I also think that in communication it would be very important to be socially mindful as a authority, that you do not make the mistake that, for example, that you communicate a lot of selfishness, and that you assume that a lot of people will be selfish. If you communicate that belief, I think it will provide a confirmation of what most people already believe, but that's also the kind of motivation that you do not necessarily want. So I think it's important to always, as an authority, to keep in mind that you also communicate the belief that people are willing to invest in collective interest, and also a good deal of fairness. Yeah, so we know that misunderstanding is part of everyday life, and they also often are caused by some communication problems, so you should be very much aware of this. And what you can do, and which is very cheap, and the Dutch always like cheap things, what you can do, you can always do a genuine smile. Thank you.
So it sounds like you might think trust is self-reinforcing somehow. If sorry, that trust is self-reinforcing, so that if people are presented as being generally trusting, then they'll trust more, and then that higher trust should lead to the perception that people are more trusting. So do you think that can explain somehow these national differences that seem quite odd? That they are self-reinforcing in, and how could you utilize that to encourage pro-social actions?
Yeah, I think that there are two things that I think are very important when I think of this survey. One is that I think that trust, also the generalized trust, that the beliefs that you have and that you develop and that you change a little bit, is based on all sorts of experiences that you have, but also the small group behavior with friends is crucial to the development of trust, that you have at least some healthy doses of trust with the people with whom you are interdependent, for example. That's one thing that I think is crucial. Also in terms of depression, that to experience, that's why social interaction is so important in this theory as well. That's what you experience, but that's also what shapes you, I think, to some degree, above and beyond genetic influences. That's one thing. The other thing that I think that when I think of the large influences of culture or national differences in generalized trust, I think some part of it has to do with how egalitarian a society is. And the more egalitarian, the more likely people are for various reasons perhaps. For example, if a society is not very egalitarian, I think there's always a little bit of a friction, like there's more suffering on the bottom end, and at the higher end, there's a lot more fear that things may be taken away. And you see that often in societies, and I think that is not a good, when you just think in terms of trust, I think that's not a good situation. And I think the Scandinavian success, to some degree, even though there's now some debate about it, may partially explain why that mentality is that structure is functional.
Some philosophers who write about ethics and values draw our attention to the notion that we have attitudes to our attitudes, and some of us actually deliberately change our attitudes. So the question is this: do you have any information or speculations about the attitudes that prosocials and competitive people have to their own prosociality or competitiveness?
I do not know how much. Well, there's one thing, for example, comparators is a very interesting group. Comparators think that everybody is competitive. And that's not only their belief, they also have a lot of confidence in that belief. And the interesting thing about comparators is that they are very easy to find confirmation for that belief. If you think that everybody is competitive, you never trust anybody, you behave non-cooperatively, and you find confirmation for it. They think that they are not unique in their competitiveness. They think they are just like everybody else. Prosocials have just a little bit of a tendency to see themselves as more prosocial than average. And, and comparators think they are not necessarily bad, they are just like everybody. Prosocials think that, and to some degree realistic, but at the group level, there's an overestimation.
What I was really asking was, do competitive people have a tendency to wish that they were more social?
It's not my impression, to be honest, but I think what competitive people, and we're talking about the competitive people, is a very interesting group. It's 15%. The interesting thing about it is that this is speculation, by the way, but I think that they think this orientation is necessary to survive. And
we've got a question over there.
Yeah. I was interested in your in how prosocial measurements in social value orientation, you say, is a very strong predictor of political voting intentions. I'm very interested in this. I'm actually the election coordinator for a political party in Oxfordshire. How do you think we could actually measure that with lots of people very quickly without getting them into labs and doing tests? Or should we do something like your picking out of 3 pens or whatever type test to find this out?
For political orientations? What I think regarding this link between social orientation and political orientation ideology is that something that I've learned is that also when you look at literature, it's amazing how personality is underneath political ideology. And it's not only social value orientation, that provides you a sort of direction towards the left or the right. And for example, in Holland we have lots of parties. And so if you look at the specific parties, that really changes. But the direction is often the same. And another powerful predictor, rooted in personality to some degree, is the fact that some people are much more open to new experiences than other people. And other people are more likely to enjoy cognitive closure and do not want to think too much about it. And the people who are more open to new experiences are more likely to be left-winged. But there's one thing, because I do not want to be too normative about those things. The nice thing about it is the right-wing people, generally speaking, are happier than the left-wing people, which is sort of interesting to know. I do not know what is left of this when you correct for salary differences.
Okay, so we've got Miles was next in there, but I might get Rob to come up and start to take some questions for both. Yeah, so. Miles.
Sure, well maybe it is a question for both actually. I've been struck, as I'm sure we all have been, by images of looters forming queues in the Philippines. I think it's an extraordinary image, that the looters in the Philippines are extraordinarily polite. But I think there's something, whereas in your social world values survey suggested primarily that fortunate people were more trusting. I mean, basically rich people are up at the top. And it does, yet we have sort of anecdotal evidence that a collective misfortune, like a hurricane, seems to have the effect of making looters form queues, which is a very interesting cooperative behavior. I mean, so I wonder if you've sort of thought a bit about whether sort of chronic misfortune, chronic good fortune appears to make people more trusting. Is temporary misfortune also having the same effect? Have you thought about that?
I completely agree that if there is an external threat is something that makes even groups bind together. So in that sense, an external threat can do miracles in that sense. Yeah, I do not know well enough all the trust data of each separate country, you know, in terms of, for example, the threats of hurricanes and other natural disasters. So I cannot really speak to that. But I firmly believe in your logic, like if there's an external threat, not only individuals, but also groups even, and that's even more surprising to some degree, because groups have a natural tendency to distrust each other more. It's a very powerful, when you compare groups to individuals, the level of distrust among groups, and also group representatives, for example, is there's a high level of distrust. So there's a lot to gain actually by perhaps external threats to groups.
Thank you. If trust is more plastic, and if you actually can teach people to be more, to trust more, can you then teach people, if people can trust more each other, probably they will tend to be more cooperative or not? Because cooperativism is more stable, right?
Yeah.
But if they can trust more, can they like switch group from individualist or competitive to prosocial?
Well, not switch in that sense, but I think it's just if you have high trust and under some circumstances, if you do not have to trust, even a prosocial person would not cooperate. So it's really a prerequisite for behaving cooperatively in many situations. And I think just a small trigger could help you, and that trigger could be, for example, in a department, if you, as a manager, for example, if you try to communicate trust and that this is a secure environment and you do not want to make competition too salient, then I think that can really help, for example, to promote organizational citizenship behavior, that people do something extra for one another, and that you don't get those very unhealthy forms of competitions. Of course, I realize that competition can be sometimes very healthy, but I'm talking about the not so great stuff that may go on. So I think, really think as a manager, for example, and I'm talking about groups, face-to-face interaction, I think you can do a lot in a department to think creatively of how you can maintain and promote trust within a group. I think it's very important, because there's also a natural tendency for people to look at the bad apples. The bad apples capture your attention, and sometimes also the bad apples are leading, in the sense that the followers will follow the bad apples rather than the good apples, so to speak.
Okay, so I'm going to ask both of you the same question, and hopefully you won't both give the same answer. So you're summoned to number 10 Downing Street, and there you find David Cameron, and he says to each of you, we are crashing the resource. We're not dealing with carbon emissions. We're not adequately dealing with climate change. I don't have any more time for research. I want you to tell me 3 things that I should do with this global tragedy of the commons to change people's behaviour. What would be the 3 things that you would tell him to do?
Shall I first? One thing that I think is crucial is shorten the time horizon and do it maybe through your children. You cannot, for example, it's very difficult to speak, to change people's behavior if the time horizon is really crucial to all those problems. But how can you psychologically make it closer to you? And I think one way is to do it to speak to the imagination of your children, for example. Then you realize, oh yes, well, I really need to do something. It's almost, you're talking about self-interest. You're speaking to self-interest, an extended self-interest. Could be a very powerful source. That's one way, at least, that I would address. I would do anything to make the time closer to you, to shorten the time delay. Axelrod talked about the shadow of the future. That I think is a really crucial first step. But there are many more steps that I can...
You've got 2 more.
Oh, okay, 2 more. Create competition between, for example, create competition between groups to be the most pro-social, to compete for cooperation. For example, make lotteries, games, who has the cleanest city in England, and offer big awards for who has the cleanest city. So you use competition, and especially at the intergroup level, groups are sensitive to competition more than individuals, and so that would be a very powerful source to enhance cooperation through the means of competition. Again, I'm really basing this on an interdependence type of analysis. I'm using the motivations that I study and to make it, turn it into something positive. So that will be the second one. The final one would be something like, if you can reduce the group size. People are evolutionary as well, I think. They are designed, evolved to be, not designed, really to be interacting in a dinner party size group. 4 or 5 people. That's the ideal size for people that they are cooperative. Beyond that, people become a little bit less cooperative. For example, when you design buildings, in Holland there was the architects always designed buildings for units of 18 people, for example, for student housing. Well, then it's quite predictable that the refrigerator will be depleted all the time, the toilets will not be clean. And so when you think of groups, manageable groups, and not think in terms of big groups that seem to be more cost effective. I think that most mergers do not succeed. I think the bigger groups, we are psychologically, we are not really, we are, again, I use the term designed, or we are really good at interacting in small groups. In larger groups, we are not always that great.